Hi everyone, so in this video we review the recently published paper titled Quasi-objective Eddy visualization from sparse drifter data. So there's a little motivation. Why are we even interested in quasi-objectively extracting eddies from sparse drifter data? Well, oceanic eddies are generally material coherent structures. So they need to be independent of the observer, which implies that they are experimentally verifiable. What all these means is that whatever theory or method you come up with to extract these eddies from sparse drift data, it would better be objective. Now, on the right-hand side, we can see the sargassum, so a sargassum patch in the North Atlantic, and this high concentration of sargassum clearly indicates the presence of an eddy. So what this objectivity requirement implies that no matter in which reference frame I observe this barrier, this transport barrier needs to be indifferent to observer changes of this type here, where Q is simply an orthogonal rotational matrix and B is simply a translation vector. Now, in the last 10 to 20 years, several objective criteria have been put forward. However, most of these criteria rely on the computation of spatial gradients. So the big question is now, what do we do in a sparse data setting? Well, we cannot afford to compute spatial gradients simply because the data points we have, or the trajectories we have, are too far apart. And such a sparse data setting is actually pretty relevant, as you can see here, for example. So here, this picture simply shows the drifter distribution in the ocean. And the drifter trajectories faithfully follow ocean currents. So they are they provide very precious information about the local ocean velocity field. That's why several metrics have been developed in the last decades, several so-called single trajectory quantities, whose purpose is to extract eddies or any sorts of coherent structures from sparse drifter data. Now, the common drawback of these metrics is that since features of a single trajectory, and with features, I mean, for example, velocity, curvature, acceleration, are inherently non-objective quantities, these metrics will also be non-objective. And furthermore, what is worse actually is that most of these metrics, they don't have any relation to an underlying physical quantity. So you can ask the question, how is the trajectory length related to features associated to material rotation? Well, there is none. So it's very difficult to tell based on trajectory length of a single drifter whether this drifter is actually in an eddy or not. To tackle this problem, a paper from 2021 by the same authors introduced a metric which is called trajectory rotation average. Now, this trajectory rotation average approximates an objective local material rotation in qualifying frames. The way this diagnostic was derived is that first you define an objective diagnostic which is related to material rotation, and then you specify conditions under which the material rotation, so under which this objective diagnostic, can be approximated using single trajectories. These conditions are twofold. One condition states that the partial derivative of the velocity needs to be smaller than the material derivative of the velocity. And the second condition is that the spatially average vorticity needs to be much smaller in size than the local rotation. Now, these two conditions have been verified in the same paper using Aviso data in the ocean. So we take for granted that these two conditions are satisfied in the ocean. Now, under these assumptions, the TRA, which is a very simple quantity, so the way you compute the TRA is simply you take the velocity, so you have a trajectory, and you take the velocity along this trajectory. Now, the TRA simply takes the average of the angle between two subsequent velocity vectors. So intuitively, you can see that it is indeed related to rotation, because if you have a trajectory which is just traveling on a straight line, then of course the angle between two subsequent velocity vectors will be zero, so the TRA will be low. However, if you have a spinning trajectory, then this angle will be higher, because you have the velocity vector, actually the orientation of the velocity vector constantly keeps changing. So the way we proceed now is we simply compute. So we have a set of drifters over some domain and over some time interval. And we simply take the set of drifters and compute the TRA for each of these drifters. Then we basically have associated to each drifter trajectory a specific TRA value. Now, what we then do is we try to reconstruct a so-called TRA field from the sparse drifter data using some classic interpolation techniques. The first data set we will be looking at is the GLAD, which is a commonly used data set located in the Gulf of Mexico. For those of you who are interested in more of checking out which drifters we have been taking. Well, we've been taking drifters which are located in this region and which are simultaneously active over this time interval. You can then plot the evolution of these drifters, and the color. So the triangles simply indicate the drifters, whereas the colors indicate the chlorophyll distributions. And this cross here indicates the outlet of the Mississippi River. So there's basically a river here, there's an outlet of the Mississippi River, which basically pushes which drives drifters towards the open sea, actually. And you can see that there is this evolving cluster of drifters. Why do I say that it's an evolving cluster? So this red cluster here. Well, because you can see that as I evolve these drifters, they remain fairly coherent, right? So they don't disperse at all. And in fact, this cluster has been frequently associated. So this patch of drifters has been frequently associated to an eddy. However, this eddy was generally not clearly observed from satellite altimetry data. Of course, we need to do some data pre-processing. So the drift trajectories were filtered using this low-pass filter. This is a standard pre-processing technique for drift trajectories, which has also been used in several other papers which use this global drifter program. Now, this is not the global drifter program, but we still use the same pre-processing techniques to be consistent. So again, if we now take this evolving drifters, compute the TRA, and then reconstruct the TRA field with respect to the current drifter positions, and then interpolate, then we get the following plot. So we get basically a so-called TRA field. Now this TRA field displays two regions with high TRA. And we recall we associate generally regions with high TRA with the presence of shear or eddies. So at the outlet of the Mississippi River, which is this region here, we have high TRA values. This is intuitively explained, which is actually explained by the fact that in coastal regions, so this is like a coastal region, you have high shear, which then leads in turn to high TRA values. And the second region where we have high TRA values is this open sea, where we have basically this prominent blob here. And you can see that this blob here was associated to this evolving cluster. So this patch here, this patch of drifters here are simply the evolving cluster. Remember, this TRA plot has been plotted with respect to the final distributions of the drifters. So if you can recall from the previous slide, we plotted with respect to this drifter configuration. Now we try to independently verify the features we get using some alternative data. In fact, we computed the LAVD field from satellite altimetry data. Now the LAVD field similarly displays this rotational feature here at the open sea. However, it does not display the high the shear at the outlet of the Mississippi River in this coastal region. So So then we also try to independently verify. So then we basically compare the TRA, so the features you get from TRA, with the features you would get if you were to apply the same procedure, simply using the trajectory length now as a diagnostic instead of the TRA. So again, we compute the trajectory length for each drifter over this time interval, and we then reconstruct this trajectory length diagnostic field with respect to the current positions of the drifters. And you see that the features, first of all, are not interpretable, because the trajectory length field, you cannot say that high trajectory length, or it's difficult to say that high trajectory length is associated to the presence of an eddy, or that low trajectory length is associated to the presence of an eddy. So the absolute value per se is practically meaningless, because the trajectory length has no relation to the underlying local material rotation and flow, whereas the TRA does, because it was derived from the local material rotation and flow. And second, yeah, of course, you get several features. However, you don't know how to interpret them. And second, they are not very pronounced, right? So it's here we have pretty sharp gradients, which you can see from these dense level sets, whereas in the TRA you don't have such sharp gradients here. The red crosses simply indicate local minimum of the TRA field. Now, in order to pass, so one would generally not deal with. So it's nice to have a scalar field. However, one would like to have precise barriers, right? And of course, we cannot give precise barriers because we're in a sparse data setting. However, we can give approximate barriers. And in fact, we designed this algorithm, which simply takes as input two arguments. So one argument is given by the fact that you need to decide on the local maximum. And of course, whenever you whenever you look for local maximum in a region, there is always some thresholding associated to it. And the second parameter is this number of trajectories which you want to be inside an eddy. And generally, this ND has been set for all the examples in the paper has been set to 2. So we generally require at least 2 drifters to be inside an eddy. You can then run this algorithm and you get this white curves, which are simply the TRA-based eddies, and we compared them with respect to these to this red curve, which is simply LAVD eddy. And you can see that, of course, in the coastal region, the LAVD field does not detect these high shear regions, simply because the LAVD satellite altimetry data is not a reliable indicator in coastal areas, whereas at open sea there is quite some match between the two. Now, bear in mind that this LAVD eddy does not capture does not capture all of the evolving drift. So this evolving cluster, which is basically this set of drifters here, is not contained inside the LAVD eddy. So that's why this evolving cluster could not be characterized from the satellite altimetry data, because it was simply not part of the eddy. The second example we consider is simply the Sargassum patch in the North Atlantic. So we take again the picture from the initial slide where you observe this Sargassum, this highly concentrated Sargassum patch here, which you would think of as an eddy, or which clearly indicates the presence of an eddy. And then what we did is we applied the TRA. So we did exactly the same procedure, but this time not to GLAD drifters, but to the GDP drifters, so to drifters from the Global Drifter Program. And you can see the setting here is much, much sparser. However, 2 eddies, which are simply these triangles, 2 drifters were found to be inside an eddy. And by running the algorithm, we can then get this red curve, and we can superimpose this red curve on the Sargassum distribution and see that indeed there is a pretty good match between the eddy derived from the drifter data using the TRA and the eddy inferred from the Sargassum patch. So again, there is a pretty good agreement between the two. So overall, in the 2 examples, we independently verified the features we were getting from the TRA applied to drifters with other sources of data, whether it be satellite altimetry or snapshots of the chlorophyll distribution. Now, to sum up, the TRA, so this diagnostic, is derived from mathematically rigorous eddy diagnostics, and it allows visualization of oceanic eddies on a range of data sets. So we have here again the 2 data sets. For more details, I would refer you to the paper. There is even a SciLight article, which I also invite you to go through. And we, of course, publish the codes on our GitHub page. So if you go on GitHub, and I will post a link in the description to the GitHub page, you can see all the codes which we use to generate all the figures in the paper. With that, I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to the next video.